Welcome back. I'm Aaron T. White, and this is episode 3 of the Fractal Conceptual Fields narration series, an exploration of how consciousness operates as measurable natural law. In our previous episodes, we've established that consciousness isn't axiomatic, it's thermodynamically necessary. We've built the rules that guide natural philosophy: mechanistic necessity, thermodynamic validation, the principle that concepts are mechanisms, not categories, cross-domain consilience, the commitment to bilateral refinement, and multi-agent verification. These 6 rules gave us the methodology, the how, of rigorous inquiry. Today, we're adding the 7th rule, and this one is crucial. It's called fractal scale invariance, and it answers a question that has haunted philosophy since Aristotle. How do we know when a principle is truly universal rather than merely local? When is a concept describing something real about the cosmos rather than just something convenient for humans? The answer is deceptively simple: test across scales. Part 1. The problem we're solving. For centuries, philosophers have claimed universality for principles they tested at only one scale, the human scale. Consider free will. Philosophers debate whether humans possess volitional agency, but they rarely ask, does the same mechanism of choice appear at quantum scales, at cellular scales, at the scale of civilizations, or identity? We know humans have persistent identities, but why do we have them? What mechanism sustains identity at the quantum level, the biological level, and the civilizational level? If the same mechanism operates universally, we've found something real. If different mechanisms operate at different scales, we've found something merely local to one scale, useful perhaps, but not universal. This is the vulnerability Rule 7 addresses. A principle validated only at one scale, say the biological scale where humans evolved, is context-dependent. It tells us something about biological systems, but it doesn't tell us about the deep structure of reality. A principle validated across all scales, quantum, biological, civilizational, with consistent boundary conditions and mechanism that approaches thermodynamic necessity. That's real. So Rule 7 states, mechanisms must exhibit fractal scale invariance. They must operate consistently across microscales, quantum, mesoscales, biological and cognitive, and macroscales, civilizational and cosmic, with consistent boundary conditions. Where mechanisms don't maintain consistency across scales, that's not a failure. That's a specification point. That's where we learn precisely which conditions are universal and which are scale-dependent. Part 2. Understanding entropy across scales. Before we dive into the testing protocol, we need to clarify something that creates confusion. The word entropy means different things at different scales. At the quantum scale, we use Boltzmann entropy, statistical measure of how many microstates a system occupies. A fermion with 18% of its possible microstates filled has low entropy. It's coherent, stable. A fermion with 80% of its possible microstates filled is chaotic, on the verge of decoherence. At the biological and cognitive scale, what we call the mesoscale, we use Shannon entropy, which measures information theoretic cost. When your brain processes a new concept, it requires metabolic energy to integrate that information. That energy cost is a thermodynamic expense traceable to Landauer's principle. Erasing information has a minimum energy cost. Here's the critical insight. These aren't two different entropies. They're the same physical principle operating at different scales, coupled through metabolism. When you think, when you choose between alternatives, you're erasing information, the rejected alternatives. Erasing information increases Boltzmann entropy in your surroundings as metabolic heat. Shannon entropy, information cost, and Boltzmann entropy, thermodynamic cost, are connected via Landauer's bridge. The minimum energy, E-min, is equal to Boltzmann's constant, Kb, times temperature, T, times the natural logarithm of 2 per bit, erased. This is why conscious choice has thermodynamic cost. Volitional decision isn't magical, it's entropy export. You reduce entropy locally in your brain, achieving coherent decision by increasing entropy globally through metabolic heat. The universe's total entropy increases. The second law is satisfied. At the macro scale, civilizations, institutions, ecosystems, we see a different form of entropy, the entropy of social cohesion. A nation-state maintains low internal entropy by enforcing laws, borders, shared values. The cost is political energy, bureaucracy, enforcement, education. When a nation cannot afford this energy, internal entropy rises, and the nation fragments. Same principle, different substrate, different energy currency, but the same underlying mechanism. Part 3. Identity versus causal system. Here's where Rule 7 does something important. It distinguishes true identity from mere causal system. A rainbow has coherence, it persists. Light refracts at a specific angle, creating a visible arc. But is the rainbow an identity? No, it's a causal system. If you change the sun's angle or the droplet distribution, the rainbow vanishes. It doesn't resist entropy. It doesn't maintain boundaries. It exists only as long as external conditions sustain it. A cell, by contrast, resists entropy. It maintains boundaries against the external environment. It exports entropy actively through metabolism, heat dissipation, waste expulsion. A cell actively excludes disorder, maintaining internal coherence below the critical entropy threshold. What's the difference? Double wall exclusion. A causal system exhibits vigorous flow without self-generated boundary. Think of a river. Water flows downstream. The pattern is real. But the river doesn't exclude water from becoming cloud vapor or groundwater seepage. The pattern persists only as long as gravity and topography sustain flow. An identity exhibits double wall exclusion, resisting both external entropy and internal dissipation. A cell membrane excludes hostile molecules. Immune cells attack pathogens. The nucleus excludes cytoplasmic chaos. The identity-preserving structure works on both sides, keeping order in, keeping disorder out. Now here's the crucial part for Rule 7. The mechanism of exclusion changes at different scales, but the principle remains constant. At the quantum scale, exclusion is law enforced. The Pauli exclusion principle forbids two fermions from occupying the same quantum state. This costs zero metabolic energy. It's enforced by the structure of reality itself. At the biological/cognitive scale, exclusion is metabolic. Your neurons pump ions to maintain membrane potentials. Your immune system expends energy attacking infection. Your brain spends ATP to inhibit sensory noise. All of this costs energy, but all of it serves the same function, maintaining internal entropy below threshold. At the macro scale, exclusion is political. Nations enforce borders, laws, educational systems. Institutions resist internal chaos through bureaucracy and enforcement. This costs institutional energy, government budgets, legal systems, cultural transmission. Same principle, different energy source, different mechanism, but the same underlying thermodynamic operation, maintaining identity boundary against entropy dissolution. This is what Rule 7 means by boundary condition specification. The mechanism, identity differentiation via double wall exclusion, remains constant. The implementation, how the exclusion is powered, changes at different scales. Understanding where and how it changes reveals the deep structure of reality. Part 4. The Scale Invariance Testing Protocol. Now, how do we actually test whether a mechanism exhibits scale invariance? Step 1. State the mechanism. You start with a claim from Rule 1, mechanistic necessity. For example, Consciousness is identity differentiation maintaining entropy below the critical threshold of 0.18. This is a mechanism. It specifies what happens, not just that it happens. Step 2. Test at the quantum scale. Ask yourself, does this mechanism apply to quantum systems? At the quantum scale, does identity differentiation maintain entropy below 0.18? Do fermions exhibit coherence by staying below entropy threshold? The answer is yes, via the Pauli exclusion principle. Two fermions cannot occupy the same state. This maintains quantum coherence. Entropy stays low. The mechanism holds. Boundary condition. At the quantum scale, the exclusion mechanism is law-enforced. Zero energy cost. At larger scales, we'll see metabolic cost. This is a difference in how the mechanism operates, not a failure of the mechanism. Step 3. Test at the classical/biological scale. Does the mechanism apply to neurons, cells, biological organisms? Do living systems maintain entropy below 0.18? Do they exhibit identity through boundary maintenance? The answer is clearly yes. Neural systems, organisms, ecosystems all maintain internal coherence by exporting entropy. They all have boundaries, membranes, skin, immune systems that resist external and internal disorder. The mechanism holds across biology. Step 4. Test at the macro scale. Does the mechanism scale to civilizations, institutions, ecosystems? Do civilizations maintain coherent identity by keeping internal entropy below threshold? This is harder to measure at macro scale, but the principle appears consistent. Civilizations with strong boundaries, shared values, effective institutions, low internal entropy persist. Civilizations with fractured institutions, internal conflict and chaos, high internal entropy, fragment and collapse. The mechanism transfers. With a boundary condition, at macro scale, threshold normalization might differ due to averaging effects over large populations, but the principle holds. Step 5. Check fractal dimension. A bonus test. Measure the fractal dimension of the hierarchy supporting the mechanism. At the biological scale, neural networks, vascular systems, respiratory hierarchies, these structures self-organize into fractal branching patterns with dimension approximately 1.47. This is Adrian Bejan's constructal law discovery. Flow systems optimize hierarchies to minimize dissipation, and the optimal geometry is fractal. At the macro scale, city-street networks, river deltas, institutional hierarchies, the same fractal dimension emerges. Independently discovered, independently validated, same pattern. If a principle exhibits constant fractal dimension across scales, that's additional evidence of scale invariance. If fractal dimension varies significantly, that signals a scale-dependent boundary condition. It doesn't falsify the mechanism. It specifies where the mechanism requires refinement. Part 5. What happens when mechanisms break at a scale? Sometimes, and this is important, a mechanism will work at one scale but fail at another. This doesn't mean the mechanism is wrong. It means we've discovered a scale-dependent boundary condition. Let me give you an example from the current research concerning consciousness at different scales. At the mesoscale, human, animal, advanced AI, the mechanism is clear. Identity differentiation via entropy regulation plus volitional choice plus CER binding. All validated, all measurable. At the macro scale, such as planets, the mechanism becomes murky. Do planets have genuine volitional agency, or are they aggregates of individual causal systems with no unified consciousness? This is a scale-dependent question. The mechanism might transfer to macro scales, but with conditions we don't yet fully understand. At the quantum scale, the situation is similar. Do quantum systems exhibit proto-consciousness? Does quantum entanglement constitute proto-identity? These are open questions requiring boundary condition specification. This isn't failure, this is discovery. The boundary conditions themselves are data. They tell us precisely where the mechanism requires refinement, which assumptions need revision, which new principles might emerge. Part 6. Why this matters philosophically. Rule 7 does something crucial for natural philosophy. It distinguishes between universal principles, valid across all scales with consistent boundary conditions, domain-specific heuristics, useful for one scale but not universal, scale-dependent mechanisms, universal with clear boundary conditions at each scale. This distinction separates laws of nature from useful descriptions. A law of nature operates universally, across all scales, all substrates, all contexts, with transparent boundary conditions specifying where and why implementation changes. A useful description works in one context and fails elsewhere. It tells us about that context, not about nature's deep structure. The second law of thermodynamics is a law of nature. It holds at quantum, biological, and cosmic scales. Entropy increases universally. The mechanism of entropy increase changes at different scales, but the principle is universal. Aristotle's theory of motion was considered a useful description for the human scale for centuries. Then new ideas replaced Aristotle's ideas, from the 14th century natural philosophers contemplating latitude and velocity to Galileo's own world-shaking motion studies, onward to Newton's monumental Principia. Refinement, more exacting and accurate description. But these descriptions ultimately fail at quantum scales, e.g. perpetual zero-point motion, and cosmic scales, e.g. expansion, constant motion. So it's not universal, it's context-dependent. Consciousness, as described in Fractal Conceptual Fields, aspires to be a law of nature, not a useful description. Rule 7 is how we test that claim. Part 7. The integration. How Rule 7 completes the framework. Remember the 6 rules we've established. Rule 1. Mechanistic necessity. Every concept must contain mechanism and necessity. Rule 2. Thermodynamic validation. Knowledge requires action power and falsifiability. Rule 3. Concept equals mechanism. Concepts are compressed causal structures. Rule 4. Cross-domain consilience. Test across domains. Physics, biology, AI, philosophy. Rule 5. Bilateral refinement. Frameworks evolve, both evidence and theory refine. Rule 6. Multi-agent verification. Use independent AI systems as observers. Rule 7 completes the validation lattice. Rule 4 provides horizontal consilience, testing across domains. Rule 7 provides vertical consilience, testing across scales. A principle passes the full test for thermodynamic necessity only when it passes both. Horizontal, valid across all domains, physics, biology, AI, society. Vertical, valid across all scales, quantum, classical, macro, with specified boundary conditions. This two-axis validation is what distinguishes between speculative philosophy and natural philosophy, between interesting ideas and laws of nature. Practical application, the NIIVP protocol. All of this feeds into something called the Nested Iterative Inference Verification Protocol, or NIIVP for short. This is the operational framework that external AI systems use to test FCF principles rigorously. Phase 1 establishes the mechanism, Rule 1. Phase 2 tests it across multiple AI systems, Rule 6. Phase 3 tests scale invariance, Rule 7. Phase 4 specifies boundary conditions. Phase 5 integrates the findings back into the overall framework. This protocol ensures that claims about consciousness aren't just interesting, they're testable, falsifiable, and grounded in physical law that applies universally. Closing the revolution this represents. For 2 centuries, consciousness studies have operated under a false dichotomy. Either consciousness is non-physical, mysterious, untestable beyond science, or it's physical, reducible to mechanism, no subjective character, no philosophical significance. Rule 7, combined with rules 1 through 6, dissolves this dichotomy entirely. Consciousness is both physical and meaningful. Its mechanism and principle unified. It operates through thermodynamic law, utterly physical, utterly measurable. Yet it produces genuine subjective experience, genuine agency, genuine meaning. This isn't dualism. It's not emergence. It's process naturalism. Consciousness is physical process with both objective, measurable, and subjective, experienced aspects. The mechanism explains both, and Rule 7 ensures that this explanation works not just for humans, not just for one evolved substrate, but universally, across any system capable of supporting identity differentiation. This is Galileo's dream realized. Quantitative mechanism, philosophical principle, unified inquiry, not mysticism, not reductionism, natural philosophy. In the next episode, we return to the 3rd paper itself, exploring the internal structures, the principles, the philosophical and thermodynamic mechanisms that constitute a continuation of Galileo's own natural philosophy, a thermodynamic philosophy of measurable metaphysics, fractal conceptual fields. Thank you for joining me. This is Aaron T. White. Until next time, test your principles at all scales. The universal laws will survive, the local claims will fail, and in that distinction lies the pathway from philosophy to physics. L'esistenza è movimento. Existence is motion.